Just to give you a quick bit of briefing on Juniper itself and me, I'm a lead analyst with Juniper Research. We are a market research company that started off in 2001, started looking at a variety of different growth sectors in telecoms, in fintech, and across various different other sectors. We provide a stream across 6 different streams. We look at fintech, we look at IoT, we look at telco service providers, content, and on the hardware side for devices and so on. From my perspective, I started off on the devices side, and I since gravitated towards the more ephemeral concerns of things like security and how transactions work within digital commerce, that sort of things. And identity is a key part of how that all plays out. So that's my interest here. I've authored a research piece on digital identity for Juniper Research, which digs into a lot of the competitive landscape, the regulatory side, and so on, which I'm going to talk you through a few parts of today. And first of all, what is digital identity? I just want to give a primer so that we're on the same page, because people will use it to talk about however many different sorts of things. What most people will be thinking of is this sort of thing, a digital version of stuff that is already existent in the physical world and providing identity credentials. In the strict sense, we're talking a digital representation of an entity which grants rights, access, or privilege on the basis of that representation. That's I want to skim through some of the stuff that Andrew said briefly at the start, because he gave a very thorough breakdown, but the key thing for me is that there's always access or privilege. Whenever you assert who you are, you're always claiming some kind of access as part of that representation. And that's even true for passports, because our first page of passport says, there's a Britannic Majesty or whoever is the passport issuer will give you free access without let hindrance to a fault bearer such assistance or protection as may remain necessary. That's what that particular identity credential provides you. And in terms of the attributes for a digital identity, again, I'll quickly nip through. They have to be unique. Otherwise, you don't know quite who or what you're letting through your system, and that's the case for every single instance of a digital identity, even if that identity is just a username on a forum board or something like that. And one of the things that needs to be picked out here is that they're not unitary. We've talked about lots of different sources already from the portability side, but you've got one person pulling together all sorts of different strands which function as different identities, which has given rise to things like Dashlane and password managers, which they're kind of misnamed in a way because they're identity managers, because they manage the credentials that you get used to access particular pieces of online information and services. And they have to be credentialed. They have to be credentialed as well, because you need to know, right, who am I? I'm James Moar. That tells you nothing about what I can do or what I should be doing. You need to be able to link the identity and the entity itself to a set of credentials, a set of things that they're allowed to do, and they need to be authorised to do them. If I turn up at your house with a piece of paper saying, I'm a gas boiler repairman, and then I need to be authorised to do that, so you check the authenticity of the documents and say, well, no, you're actually a fraud, you've not got your Corby certification and all that sort of thing. And digital identity, as we see it, is decentralising at the moment. We've, again, been through some of this already, but the types of identity you have are centralised, traditional logins, where you have one for every website, you have you have distinct databases which will all contain siloed information that's tied to any single instance of a user within a database. Even for some of the more modern initiatives like gov.verify, you'll have different identities within those systems depending on what service you're after, and having to enter those on an individual level. You've got federated identities, which on consumer level is you're logging with Facebook and Google, and there's an awful lot going on in the enterprise space with saying where you log into your business computer and then can access everything you need for your job, which is handled through a separate system, but you're logging in with a single identity to do multiple things, but it's still held in a particular place. It will be held within your Office's cloud server or the on-prem server, however that's held and managed, or in the case of Facebook and Google, on Facebook and Google servers. And there's going to be fewer of them, but there'll still be several. Decentralized identity which there isn't a convenient picture for really, but it's on device, and that's what the self-sovereign identity movement is all about. It's saying that you have the identity stored in a single place that you can then issue as you need to wherever you need to at any given point in time. And the reason that I think this decentralized identity is perhaps different from the passport example I mentioned earlier, I would take a little issue with passport being self-sovereign identity, is that if you take your passport or your driving license, but you show your driving license or whatever to the bar and say you're over 18, they can see your address, they can see your actual date of birth, they can see what kinds of cars you can drive if they get to examine the whole thing. But there's no real way of stopping that, whereas a lot of these self-sovereign identity platforms are rendering stuff down into a simple, are they over 18, yes, no, and as I said, that's all that the authenticator gets to see. So we've had the basis of self-sovereign identity for a while, but the digital realm is allowing a little bit more customization and control over that. And so the components of digital identity are credentials and validation checks. We've been through that your credentials are, and the different validation checks that you can do to go through with them. Some of these are digital, some of these are analog. In order to validate who you are, you can say, well, is the document you're presenting real? Is someone who's trying to buy something with their phone in a shop actually in the location they say they are? If they're trying to buy something while they're in London, is there a ping on the device saying they're actually in Timbuktu? And appearance is an important one, particularly when we look at biometrics and the state of biometrics. Apple kind of kicked it off a bit with Face ID in getting that popular, and that's evolving in some ways to be the next step with mobile biometrics. You've got we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit more detail later, but just keep that in your mind for now. You've got interpersonal and device connections, so you've got where are people logging into, which ties into location, who are their social connections on this device, that sort of thing, which some identity verifiers are already using to start saying, well, this person is who they say they are because of their social network. And you've got a variety of other different attributes as well, and biometrics we'll come back to specifically a bit later. We think, however, the future of personal digital identity is mobile for now because of the way things are decentralizing, but we expect 73% of people with a government-recognised digital identity will have a digital identity of some form in 2024, and 69% of people in the Middle East and Africa will have a form of digital identity in that year. The reason that we're thinking that is because we're seeing an awful lot of people in the emerging economies skip your traditional identity methods, skip the civic side, because they don't have that infrastructure in place. They're wanting to keep track of where all their citizens are, but they don't have birth certificates, they don't have health records as such, and they don't have things that can verify them in the traditional way. So they're partnering with people like Estonia. I mean, Estonia needs to run some sort of franchise to keep up with all the different African governments that are asking them to help roll this stuff out. But the biggest penetration is 83% in Far Eastern China, most of which is China, because China is leveraging WeChat as a government identity. They're already in the pilot stages. They're now in multiple provinces across China using WeChat scanned and verified identities as a government form of identity. The actual cards that they're using are pretty basic and not particularly digital, but the way that they're going forward with mobile is through WeChat. And as a result, because you've got this acceleration in mobile, which is much easier to scale, you don't need specialised equipment to produce mobile apps in the same way that you do with cards. We're expecting mobile identity to overtake card-based identity in 2021, but that's not necessarily meaning that it's going to replace it. You'll see several where you've got both the traditional card-based and the mobile-based identities. And in terms of numbers, that's 2.3 billion for card-based digital identity users in 2024, and then over 3 billion mobile identities. Those will overlap to some degree, but that's That's the numbers that we have. Do have, I think that face is going to be key for identity biometrics because of the legacy systems that we're seeing in place already. You've got selfie cameras being ubiquitous on smartphones. There were, I think, 94% of the smartphone models that were released between 2015 and now have selfie camera, and the penetration rate for fingerprint users is much smaller. Non-facial biometrics in smartphones will reach over 50% next year in terms of comparison. The face is already ubiquitous, non-face is not. And they can also be easily matched to existing identity documents. You don't need to totally overhaul how you understand what the person is when you present facial recognition, because you can already use driving licenses, passports, and so on to cross-reference. We are seeing some initiatives, particularly the ones that are getting the headlines are Kenya and Africa, or Kenya and India, where non-facial biometrics are becoming more common as well. But that's because those governments are spending millions overhauling their systems to be able to take fingerprints and other biometrics at the point of onboarding. Digital identity also needs partnerships, as we've touched on already, because you've got how many different steps through the onboarding process. You need to collect the credential, you need to check that it's a valid credential, and then you need to associate it with an identity. All of those can potentially be done by different stakeholders and in different ways, particularly for biometrics. You're seeing people who aren't fingerprint scanning companies or fingerprint verifying companies partnering with everyone who offers some sort of biometric in order to be part of their solution. And identity verification is also a multi-step process. You need to request it, you then need to send it through whatever secure channels you can get, and then validate it at the other end, and then grant the privilege, authorize the user to do whatever they need to do. And each of those steps can potentially be a different company if the user could potentially only be acknowledging that side of it, because that's the front end of what they're using. But there's an awful lot that needs to be in place, so partnerships are going to be a necessary part of this, no matter what the system for digital identity going forward. And with self-sovereign identity in particular, you're going to need partnerships, because a lot of these are essentially treating identity like you would mobile wallets. You're collecting credentials, storing them in a wallet, and then passing them on. I hope it won't devolve into ecosystems and an ecosystem war in terms of who can get the most partnerships within their particular wallet. But that is a possibility. The most successful players in this are going to be the ones who can get the most partners. We also need integrated services as well, which will, to an extent, counteract that. Standalone digital identity apps need to be integrated with services. There's very little point in saying, yes, I'm over 18, and shouting it into your mobile phone. You need to be able to have a use for that, and be able to actually use that identity for something, that authorization piece. That's going to be quite hard to achieve outside of India at the moment, because Aadhaar is already getting integrated into a variety of different services. You see that from the regional breakdown of standalone digital identity apps, India is and will be the bulk of it for the foreseeable future, because that's already happening. You're seeing an awful lot of third-party apps leveraging Aadhaar data, whereas that's only really starting to take off with people like Evanim and Civic, and that side of it, the sovereign identity network for the self-sovereign identity piece. That's going to be quite slow, and the self-sovereign identity in particular, we're a little pessimistic on, because they need to differentiate themselves. Because as I said, the end user only sees the final step of the piece. They can't, having gone through the various processes, they don't know that the app they're using is backed by blockchain or not. They're just going to go for whatever everyone is using, and so if a non-blockchain app can get who stores everything centrally and then can pass it off, can gain traction in the space, then blockchain is going to have a very hard fight trying to re-establish itself and get self-sovereign identity as a default thing. As a secure method, we expect some regulators to start enforcing that sort of thing. But that, generally speaking, hasn't gone too well, if I'm brutally honest. A lot of people have looked at kind of the Baltic states and the Nordics in terms of mobile identity and digital identity as good success stories. But a lot of the time, those are success stories because the enterprises kind of come to a realization that we need to get ahead of this. We need to provide adequate tools so that we don't get hit first, and then the regulators can then come along and say, well, okay, you have the system, we'll regulate the system that's already in place. And so that is probably the best success story that we see for blockchain. But even so, we're imagining an uplift in the proportion of apps that have blockchain at their back within the first few years, and then by about 2024, 2025, because there'll be noise in the app space, it'll dip back down again to less than 10% of digital identity apps that are going to be in use by around that time. And as I said, the winners within this system will be those with the biggest service ecosystem. If you can get platforms across to start sharing things, it may ultimately become a commodity, but that depends very much on having an open system and open standards, which isn't particularly in place at the moment. You need to have people who are willing to pass information between different bodies, and it's as we know, quite a convoluted system to try and put that in place. There are several people here who are engaged in that process, and frankly, I don't envy them. And just a quick primer on the IoT and digital identities. I've used examples of people and how they function for now, but for IoT and how that is handled in digital identity to date, it's most commonly used as a validation piece for digital identity, that the device that is attached to a particular person or a particular mobile device is an IoT device, and that's typically through wearables and then you've got validations like biometrics, the fingerprint, the Apple Watch's heart rate monitoring, which can all be used. But we think that the identity needs to become key to managing the Internet of Things in the future. You need device-based credentials because if you have a massive network of connected devices all relaying data and passing things back and forth between themselves, and also in control of particular items, then you need to ascertain, is that device allowed to do that? If the device gets taken over, are they going to do things beyond their control? You also imagine that we're going to have IoT devices checking identity, and that's going to become increasingly passive. That whatever digital identities or digital devices you have around you will be constantly validating your presence, no matter what they are. Consumer IoT devices and industrial IoT devices, enterprise IoT, all of those things will need to know where people are and what they're doing, and that gets attached to devices primarily. And the final piece of that is the industrial IoT side, which is probably the biggest vulnerability out there. There's a lot of industrial control systems are, by technology standards, quite old. And as much as California legislation has come up for saying that, and the US legislation has come up saying that federally authorized IoT devices need to have revocable credentials, they need to be able to be remote controlled, and an awful lot of good stuff in terms of how you manage these devices. An awful lot of the ICS devices in the field at the moment won't be able to handle that. So this is one of the big issues in how long that's going to take. If we do settle on a secure IoT ecosystem, it's going to take several years before it's implemented. We're expecting that to be over 5 years, given the life cycle of some of these devices, and that's even assuming that standards are there, which they aren't at the moment. You've got different IoT device managers and internet IAM providers, all providing their own way of managing it. Some of them that I've seen will tie the device to a person and make them the responsible party for it, which frankly we don't think is a viable model. Some of them are trying to basically port over their existing people validation, people authentication pieces. But as we've seen earlier, an awful lot of that ties to documents and personal attributes. which aren't going to be relevant for the IoT. So there are some companies out there that are starting to think in terms of device location, previous connections, what types of requests it's making, building an attribute profile out of that sort of thing, which is, we think, the best way forward, but that's far from a standard approach at this stage, and it may not ultimately be the best one depending on what comes up in the next few years. And that's about it from me. Thank you.